The United States Information Agency presents The Conversation Continues with our guest today, George Soros.
My foundation is called Open Society Foundation. And I think this concept of open society is one that perhaps hasn't properly been digested. I mean, I use it, but it's not sort of generally recognized. And I wonder whether really creating open societies shouldn't be an objective, for instance, of American foreign policy. I mean, we have made a lot of mistakes in a lot of places. And we currently see what's happening in Bosnia, of course. But there was, of course, a sort of a strong anti-communist streak in American foreign policy. But at the same time, of course, we are always very geopolitical, very realpolitik in our thinking. What are America's interests? And it was interpreted in terms of geopolitical interests. I think that it is in our interest to create open societies in the former communist empire, and it's more. I think it's better if we talk in terms of open and closed societies than in terms of communism and anti-communism, because communism is well and truly dead. I mean, I think it's not going to revive for a good while. See? And yet there is a very grave danger of closed societies replacing the communist regimes. And I mean, communism was a universal closed system. And you now have the danger of it breaking up into particular closed systems, finding a different ideology, which is basically most likely based on ethnic identity or nationalism, but creating closed societies. And these are a grave danger to peace in the world. And I think they are really opposed to our interests, because in order to create these new closed societies based on nationalism, you need an enemy against whom you can mobilize society behind the state. And if you don't have an enemy, you have to invent one. That was, I think, let's say, the main motive force behind anti-Semitism in the Nazi regime. But you do have real enemies. The Serbs and the Croats managed to become real enemies, and both those countries are in danger of becoming closed societies. So I think that this concept of open society has not been sufficiently recognized, and I think being at USIA, I thought that I might draw your attention to it, that this is a concept that maybe USIA ought to kind of espouse and propagate a little bit.
Paul?
Very good point.
I guess I have two questions, but one is to sort of maybe ask you to say a little bit more about your choice of open societies as opposed to democratic societies, because I think you've chosen the word deliberately, and I'd be interested in that. But the other is the question I had in mind before was to ask you about how you see the security relationship between the United States and Eastern Europe, or maybe more broadly between the West, that is to say NATO, and Eastern Europe. Right after the Cold War ended, whatever date you pick, a lot of people said, well, there doesn't need to be any relationship because there aren't any security problems anymore and we don't need NATO anymore. The strongest dissenters from that view were people like Václav Havel and Lech Walesa, and I found that when I needed a quote to support NATO, I'd do much better going to the East Europeans than going to the West Europeans. All of that was sort of before Yugoslavia, and I suppose now some people might say, well, yes, there are real security problems, but NATO has proven itself incapable of dealing with them, to which my answer would be in part, NATO is incapable of dealing with some kinds of security problems, but others it might in fact deal with much better. Underlying it all, I think, is the question of the relation with Eastern Europe versus the relation with Russia. And a lot of people have suggested we shouldn't get involved even in minimal security relationships with Eastern Europe because it might antagonize the Russians. And I guess I'd be interested in your view. I will tell you my own is that we ought to do the opposite. We ought to embrace a security relationship closely with Eastern Europe and with Russia. And as long as Russia remains on a democratic course, I think we in fact have a great deal of security interests in common. And if Russia veers off of that course, then that will be precisely when we need the relationships with Eastern Europe. But I wonder whether you think it's important and how you would balance it.
I think democracy is, first of all, it's much abused term. I mean, you had people's democracies and so on. Secondly, democracy is a very treacherous term because it implies the rule of the majority. And if you carry that aspect to its logical conclusion, it leads you to ethnic cleansing. Because all you have to do is you have to exterminate the minority and you have got your majority consolidated. So it isn't just rule of the majority. It's respect for minorities that is really the key to an open society. I think it's a key to democracy also. But somehow I think open society is a broader term. I mean, I don't mind democracy as an expression. I just think it's not quite sufficient. It doesn't stress also the fact that there is a society other than the state, that civil society as distinct from the state, and also then in the economy, a market economy. I mean, the concept is based on the recognition that nobody has a monopoly of truth, that there is no ultimate truth, and that we are all fallible, and therefore we have to learn to live together. And that leads you to democracy in government. It leads you to a market economy because you need the signals of a market to indicate when you are wrong. So I realize it's a fairly difficult term because it's based on a philosophical idea, an epistemological idea, Popper's idea that you can't verify any scientific laws, you can only falsify them. So it's sort of the fallibility of our understanding. But I think it's very important to get that across.
Just ask a quick question, follow on. I don't want to interrupt the train, but isn't there a danger of a kind of anarchism in some of these countries? And doesn't democracy offer people a mechanism for dealing with social problems that involves order at the same time as freedom? And doesn't just to call it an open society perhaps run the risk that people will think you're simply talking about everyone doing his own thing, no law, no structure?
Well, certainly in my conception of open society, it is a structure. It is not, in fact, your point is very good, by the way, because I think that one of the errors that we have made in regard to dealing with the post-communist world is that we didn't realize that, let's say, a free market is not just simply everybody pursuing his own self-interest, that an open society can only survive, if people care about having an open society, if it itself is a social ideal for which people are willing to make sacrifices. And in fact, the sacrifice we ought to have made would have been to help those countries more than we did, because open society is a more sophisticated form of organization. It's so sophisticated that you don't even know it's there. You know, if you're a closed society, you know the state is there, and you know that it's a system, and it's, you know, what the rules are and so on. In an open society, it's so subtle that you may forget that there are institutions, and the market is an institution. I mean, you could not have markets without some regulation. There have to be laws, you know, and the main support for an open society is actually law, the rule of law. Without the rule of law, without contract, for instance, you could not have markets.
I stole
Paul
Wolfowitz's time.
Just from a different angle, I found when I was in Asia that to talk about openness as a goal was something that people could accept as a sort of general proposition. When you started to talk too much about democracy, you got a reaction, well, you're just trying to impose your system on us. And they think when an American says democracy, it means a president and 2 houses of Congress and a Bill of Rights and 2 parties, and then they say, well, we're very different. But if you talk about openness, you'll necessarily agree with it, but it's a much more somehow universal principle.
I think in America right now there is a concern about nihilism or relativism that shies away from the talk of openness. Karl Popper, who was one of your great mentors, was not a cultural relativist, as I understand him.
Right.
Despite what you said about one can hold that there's no final truth, which induces a certain kind of humility, but not necessarily feel all systems are the same. One of the things that I find remarkable about the way you have approached social change is your investment in ideas and education. You seem to feel that there is an intellectual infrastructure that's very important to a society and can't be ignored.
Yeah, I mean, since open society is a sophisticated structure, you need sophistication, you need education. It's a very difficult structure to bring into existence, and it has, of course, its own flaws. It's not by any means the be-all and end-all. And one of the weaknesses is that you don't have a final answer. You don't have a simple answer. See, to build a system, to believe in a system which recognizes the fallibility of human intellect is a very difficult system to work with, as opposed to someone telling you, this is true and this is what you have to believe in. This is our country and we have to hold together, right or wrong. You see, so and there is I think a shortage of values, so to speak. There's a hiatus somewhere when it comes to values, because for very few people is open society a value in itself. Now, interestingly, it is a value for many people in Eastern Europe, people who have fought against communism or who have opposed communism, have opposed it because it wasn't open, because it imposed a dogma. So I've had very little difficulty in, let's say, communicating with people on this issue in Eastern Europe. I have a great deal more difficulty in America or in Western Europe. I mean, in fact, somebody said to me the other day, I didn't realize that I lived in an open society. You know, so and people certainly don't think it's something that you really perhaps ought to go to war for. I mean, we are not willing, for instance, to defend certain basic principles which we ought to defend in Bosnia, because we don't have the values that would take us there. So there is a problem of values in open society and in modern society, and that's why fundamentalism of all kind is so appealing. I mean, be it nationally or ethnically based or religiously based, because there you have a fixed set of values. And I'm arguing that open society is a value. It certainly is to me. But it is, in fact, the value that is guiding my actions, and that is what I am spending my money on. See? But I don't think it is generally. And that, and I think we will pay a very heavy price for it, because when it is endangered, it will become a value. It's a free good in America.
Maybe the absence of a strong consensus about it is a security problem. To get back to Paul's questions, Rose.
Well, I
would like to actually come back to the second question, if I may, because it has that, or maybe you want, and then we come back to that.
Let's go back to security after just a second. I was thinking as you were speaking that there's probably a very narrow range of real enemies of an open society. The one I thought of when we were talking about education, and that is passivity, and that's a great deal of what I think we're dealing with in the newly independent states and what we're dealing with even in Eastern Europe. These are populations in many cases who were educated to passivity, essentially, and that means that they do not become engaged in the society in the way you need if you want your value system to begin to operate in an open society. At the other end of a very narrow spectrum of these true enemies, as I would call them, is dogmatism and fundamentalism, a too narrow definition of what your values are that are defended without any view to what other possibilities are out there, and without any judgment as to how you can consider what the future might hold if you stick so firmly and push so hard on a very narrow range of goals and values. But that is why I think it's so important to think about education as a way to break both the cycle of passivity in Eastern Europe, in the NIS. That is, taking children who are accustomed to thinking along a very group-oriented line and allowing them the ability and instilling in them the ability over time to make decisions for themselves and to solve problems for themselves. And that's an important goal.
You see, I think what activates people is interest, right? So usually people get active in pursuit of some very specific interest, self-interest of some kind of communal interest. So it can be, let's say, nationalism. You can mobilize. You could mobilize it. People behind class war, because it was done, or behind religion, or behind some within a democratic society, behind some interest. But you see, the shortcoming of open society or of democracy is that it's not enough generally just to be a Democrat. See, then you have to be a liberal Democrat or a social Democrat. You must, you must have a particular point of view as well as believe in the system. See, in other words, democracy allows particular interests to be meshed together, right? But there is the general interest of having democracy. You see, and that's let's say the belief in an open society. So that you actually must be at a certain point be willing to be more concerned about the system, the form of social organization, which I call open society, than your particular interest. See, and that's very difficult to get to.
I take it that's not just a question of theories, but of habits, sort of social customs
and behavior.
Yeah.
And behavior.
Well, as I say, this is something that does motivate people in Eastern Europe. I mean, if you think of communism as a universal closed system, right? There were basically people who were opposed to it because it was universal. These were, let's say, people more inclined to be nationalist. They were there, in some way, they were hurt in their national identity. And there were people who were opposed to it because it was closed. And these are basically, let's say, the Democrats. You could see it very clearly in Hungary, where these were the two groups that were opposed were active. And the nationalist, then actually went quite far in this anti-Semitic nationalist, the Hungarian way. It has now become a party. You see, it's another form of closed society that they are interested in creating. But you have got the other people who were opposed to communism because it's closed, and they are basically the Democrats. So I think that now that communism is dead, you see, we have to still distinguish between open and closed society, and we should still work towards open society, and we should still resist those who want to create new forms of closed society. And if we did that, I think in foreign policy, I think we would have avoided many of the mistakes that we have made in Yugoslavia, throughout Eastern Europe. We did, you see, because we did not, beyond communist, non-communist, we did not pay any attention to what's inside the country or what people stand for. And I think that we ought to be actively engaged in creating democratic societies, open societies.
Let's open this up. There may be questions, there may be debates. Just introduce yourself and yes.
I'm James O'Dea with Amnesty International. And I think the points that have been made about passivity and the inheritance of the post-Cold War era reflect the reality that repression works, that repression is designed to pacify people, and that what we experience is a whole series of conditioning that people now have and that they live under. And my questions focus on the process whereby one then stimulates the revisioning process, where you go to a people that have been repressed and you say, it is time to aspire anew, to revision the world, and here are your rights. You have a whole set of new rights that you didn't have before. And what you think is the most effective educational process that gives them ownership of an emerging vision of their rights, and not one that is somehow a sort of consumerist notion that out there the Western democracies have a vision of your rights that you can buy from them. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a central idea. And one of course, the experiences of an organization like Amnesty is that in the process of human rights education, you have to have simultaneously the elements of rule of law and protection, because as people revision and re-aspire to their rights, they start to flex their muscles, and they need those walls of legal protection, the kind of rule of law principles, to protect them as they aspire. But my central question is, how do we get to that grassroots sense of human rights education?
You see, I think that the concept of the rule of law is the most difficult concept to promote. Actually, you run into it all the time. You know, the good guys, the Democrats, are just as arbitrary as the bad guys, and everybody feels that I'm a good guy, therefore I can do whatever I think is right, and the idea that you have to abide by certain legal constraints is just very, very difficult. It's a very abstract thing. But I think the answer to your question is success. I think that if you can have an experience of success is the best way to establish a new system. You see, it has to work. And the big difference between Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union is that there, in Eastern Europe, or Central Europe, there is a new system by and large that is working by and large. And people can see that there is a new system, it's working. Maybe they are excluded, maybe their standard of living is falling because actually still the general standard is still falling. But you see people succeeding. And whereas and maybe it is to some extent beginning to happen now even in Russia, but the conditions there are much more chaotic. And I think the most important single step towards establishing a new system and making it work is having a monetary system that works. And when you look at, for instance, Estonia, which stabilized the currency, and within a year, I mean, people are not much better off in Estonia than they are in Lithuania, but there is a much better spirit in the country because they see that something is working. So it's really success. And what has been so sadly lacking in the former Soviet Union is success. Ever since Gorbachev started on perestroika, basically nothing worked. Everything got worse. Everything is breaking down. And I mean, I have it in our internal, in the foundation in Moscow, which has been an extremely, let's say, disappointing institution. Started in '87, and it went through a lot of turmoil. And instead of leading the transformation, it was caught up in the transformation. Finally, we had one project that worked. And it totally changed the spirit of the foundation. You see, people had this sense that they were actually accomplishing something. So it weren't just empty words, but it was really some real accomplishment. And there was one project that did it.
To hear you talk, it is very, I think, reminiscent of some of the problems we face with somewhat limited resources as we go out and try to look at projects in the NIS, particularly in areas where we would like to make a very real difference. Semipalatinsk and their problems with cleanup, for example, in Kazakhstan, the nuclear test site there, an enormous problem, and one that would make you throw up your hands, I think, in many ways. Nuclear reactor safety is another area where I think one wants to throw up one's hands and say it's just too big a problem. But I wonder if there is not an argument to be made for careful selection across the board of examples where you think you can get some success, and then that in turn has a good effect, an effect that spreads out, and an exemplary effect, in fact. I would be pleased to hear you comment on that point, because there are big problems to wrestle with out there and limited resources.
Yeah, I think that if one could find some example of success, it would be very useful. I mean, and I have a sense that in Russia now, there may be some. See, you begin to have new organizations in extremely difficult conditions, because if you don't have stable money, it's extremely difficult to operate, and also you don't have you have a conflict of authorities,
right?
And you know the problems. So, but nevertheless, I think there are now some enterprises that are. I had a man come in for lunch today from St. Petersburg, and he told me that he's a millionaire. We gave him a grant in '87, '88, and he set up a children's clothing factory. And I mean, the story was too too good to be true. In fact, I said I'm going to check this out because I couldn't believe it. How successful he has been. Apparently, he's been successful. That was, so it may be happening.
If people are successful in Russia, do they try to hide it?
Fun? No, he's very upfront, and he claims to be a millionaire, and dollar millionaire, and he says, I'm clean and so on. And I asked him, what's the difference between you and the mafia? And it was very interesting. He says, I'm clean and they are not. But in actual fact, I'm not sure that there is all that much difference.
Does he have some sense of pride in
he's
creating jobs?
No. I mean, it really was a very. As I say, if I could believe it, I would be really thrilled, because he says I feel a sense of social obligation because you gave me a start, and now I want to do the same, and I mean, it probably is actually probably true.
As the added advantage of being true.
Right.
Yes. Carl? Carl Gershman from the National Democratic Institute represents a number of private organizations, National Endowment for Democracy, a number of private organizations in the United States.
George, if you would just comment on how you understand the distemper or the moroseness that seems to characterize all Western societies today. I mean, the sense of discontent, which is so deep-seated, and what can be done to try to turn that around? Because a lot of us feel that there's a kind of the balkanization that you see over in Eastern Europe is in a sense mirrored by an increasing divisiveness and a lack of an understanding or a commitment to those things which unite us as a society and a people. I'm sure it has something to do with the values of freedom, open society, democracy. I'm not going to get into a long discussion of semantics, but how do you understand the period that we're in now, which seems to be so unique in terms of the discontent that seems to be so deep-seated among the people, and what might be the way out of this?
Well, first of all, it's not unique, because you have had the decline of the West ever since you have had the West. I mean, so we always have that feeling of something, some crisis. But I think we are in a crisis, and I think it is deeper than it used to be. I think it's quite severe, and I think that institutions in this country that have really worked for 200 years are no longer working. I'm talking about, for instance, political institutions, and I do think it's a crisis of values. And it has to do with the spread of market economy, because the market it creates exchange value. You see, you value something for what it can, for the money, the money that what it can get you, right? So the exchange value then becomes the dominant value, and as a dominant value, it's just simply not adequate. Because there has to be something ultimate that you value. Otherwise, what's the good of money? Now, of course, most people don't have enough money, so they don't think about this. I happen to be an exception, so I actually thought about it. What's the good of it? So that other people are envious of you. So you do have to have some value other than the exchange value. And because values are not fixed, they are in some way determined by social conditions. The spread of market economy, as everything gets marketized, see, the market gets more and more, permeates more and more aspects of existence. It becomes the dominant value. I mean, 100 years ago, you had, crafts. People took pride in making shoes or whatever, or you had doctors until a few years ago who took pride in curing people. There still are doctors who would like to feel that way, but the pressures are to turn being a doctor into a business. You see? And so you measure your success by how much money you make as a doctor. And that leads you to activities which are not really professionally guided. So I think there is this serious, there ought to be a sense of right and wrong as distinct from what works and what doesn't work. And when you look at politics, right, I mean, to be a hard-headed, successful politician, you must get elected. And what matters is, you know, what the public opinion polls say, and how does it play. You know, okay, you bomb. What did we bomb lately? Iraq. You know, and your rating goes up. You know. Now, I mean, you ought to be really thinking about, should we bomb Iraq or not, and not what it does to your rating. So, and I'm not being critical of our president as such, because I just use that as an example. It's true of every politician now, you see. And that is what is undermining our political system, because we used to elect representatives for what they stood for. But now they stand for what we elect them for, right? So there is a circularity about it, you see, which is unstable.
When we talk about societies and the struggle with the decadence, or perhaps with a cycle of decline, we're pushed to the basic meaning of freedom, which is whether we are caught in some inevitable cycle or there are opportunities for renewal with the individual or with the society. And you clearly must believe that, because you've made enormous investments in it.
No, I certainly don't believe that there is anything inevitable about history. I think that history is determined as we go, because, you see, there is a connection, and it has to do with our imperfect understanding, that we act on the basis of how we see things, which is not how things are. You see, so that divergence introduces an element of indeterminacy into history all along, and so you know, if you would have to have perfect knowledge for history to have a predetermined course. So I'm a very firm believer in being able to influence our destiny, but at the same time, we can't just sort of create our destiny. In other words, we are very much bound by reality, and we can just sort of curve it at the edges and not change the whole
Part
scene.
of the earlier interest you talked about may be which is, I think you exemplified, taking an interest in the future of the idea of an open society, which is a renewal in itself.
But you see, it does get pretty philosophical or abstract, because open system, you see, is in fact open. It does not have an equilibrium. It's not there is no equilibrium, and it's an evolving system. It's an evolutionary system, and so you curve it at the edges, and everybody curves it at the edges a little bit, and in itself it doesn't mean very much, but the next minute that is the reality with which you deal, and that gets twisted a little bit, and that's how it evolves, and it can take a totally different course if, you know, as a result of rather trivial little incidents.
Let me see if there are two more questions here. And everybody here, of course, wants you to tell them where to invest for their retirement. But you've led us to a certain philosophical level. So let me take Dick Sinnott and then Mort Kondracki. Dick?
George, when I listen to you talk about open society, it often makes me think of the remark that Montesquieu made in The Spirit of the Laws, that you are free when you can hear a number of voices inside your head at the same time. But what I wonder about is just how many voices one of that sort one can hear practically. I mean, for your conception of an open society, how practical is it, in a sense, that people are able to do that? We would like it to happen. Mm-hmm. People are able to hear those voices when they're when they're engaged in something very negative, but in that dull, boring work of building something up, maybe the number of those voices diminishes.
What do you mean by voices?
Well, I mean that
voices
you can,
that you listen to that give you commands, or that
well,
whisper?
what Montesquieu meant was that you could imagine many different points of view at the same time, and that you could identify with them. That it wasn't just a matter of interest, you know, that you knew that other people had other interests, but that you could shift your own sense of what's real from now one thing to another. And as you know, that was very important for Popper, too, that you weren't totally committed to saying, this is what I am, this is what I think. But I wonder if now, I'm really asking a question about this, you know, how much of that ability to really experience difference is possible not when people are tearing something down, where they must hear different voices, but when they're trying to build something up. Doesn't the sort of range of freedom get, oddly enough, more constricted in the kind of moment we're in now?
I think there are two things in your question, if I understand it correctly. One is, of course, in a revolutionary moment, you see, the range of possibilities is much, much larger. And we just lived through, or are still living through, such a period in Eastern Europe. And there, you know, it's practically, it's wide open. And then it narrows down. And we are now set, for instance. I mean, I thought in '89 that, in fact, the former communist region could make the transition to an open society, if only one threw sufficient energy into it, you see. And I still believe it, actually. Of course, the energy wasn't there, and I think there was also a large element of illusion in my own approach to it, you see. But I certainly believed in it, and I see it narrowing down. I see it sort of cooling off. You know, it's like basically you know, the first 4 minutes of creation. A lot of things could be accomplished that are much more difficult later on. So that's one part of your question. Was that your question?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking you a question I don't certainly have an answer to, which is just how much difference can people stand? A lot of what, as I read you, and have read you, your notion of an open society is that people become very tolerant to an open system, which has a lot of ambiguity. There aren't answered questions.
I don't think people necessarily become tolerant. In fact, my mentor, Karl Popper, is well known for being quite intolerant to us. So, you know,
That's an intriguing Hollywood.
What? It's not a question of being tolerant, but rather a question of putting value on tolerance. I mean, you know, you must recognize the value of diversity, of minorities. It doesn't mean that you actually tolerate them, you know, but you know that you are breaking your own recipe. So,
but don't you think that in a way the problem? I mean, when you take a closed system away from, or when it breaks down, the problem is maybe how to find a way to maneuver, to live in an open system. And that problem experientially is very difficult for people to say, you're in an open system, nothing is known.
But you see, I can only talk from personal experience because I've treated financial markets as an open system, you see, without equilibrium. And
you don't think it's all fantasy?
What?
You don't think it's all fantasy?
No, it's not all fantasy, but it's also not predetermined, and there is no equilibrium and so on. And I'm extremely attuned to those voices, you see, that whisper to me that maybe I'm wrong, you know. And I listen to it all the time, and actually that is my particular strength, that I recognize. I look for my own mistakes and I recognize them. It's not that I'm more right than others. It's that I'm more ready to correct my faults or my mistakes. But I've been encouraged by my success. You see, it's been reinforced by success. I think if I didn't have that success, I'm not sure that I'd be quite so open.
Mort?
When we look at what's happening in various parts of the former communist world, what we see is cauldrons boiling, in some cases boiling over, and dangers of international warfare and so on growing out of this. Now, in view of those developments, how optimistic are you, just in general, that this movement will proceed in a good direction? And the second thing is, to sort of drag you back to a question that Paul Wolfowitz tried to get you into, to what extent do we go beyond simply good works, benevolence, to power? In other words, how much do we have to set up a security structure such that if somebody begins to misbehave, the civilized world is going to crack them in order to put things right?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring back, because I really wanted to come back to your question. I think there is a security vacuum in that part of the world, and it's very, very dangerous because it's a vacuum. Somehow it's going to be filled by insecurity, of course. And I do think that our vital interests are at stake, and that's the point I was trying to make, that we have to recognize that, for instance, in Bosnia, our vital interests are at stake, and we have made a very serious mistake in letting the situation get out of hand the way we did. You see, and we could have stopped it almost any moment along the way. And we can't stay out of it, even though we are trying desperately. And we have suffered a major setback in Bosnia. I mean, it's a big setback for our civilization. And I don't think that this has sunk in at all.
If there is one thing that needs to be done by people who believe as you do, that Bosnia is somehow a vital national interest of the United States, it is to articulate what that interest is.
Right.
Because to explain, that there may be a war between the Albanians and the Serbs, exploding over international borders, et cetera, just passes by people's ears. They don't hear it, so what? It's far away and so on.
You see, this is why, and unfortunately, you have to go back to something abstract, which is open society. I mean, it so happens that Sarajevo is a beacon of open society. It is genuinely multi-ethnic. It happens to be largely Muslim, but Muslims were the city dwellers in that part of the world. Instead of that, we have this image, partly fostered by our unwillingness to get engaged, that, well, they are Muslims, therefore they are fundamentalists, therefore they are somehow not. I mean, the prejudice against Muslims in Europe is amazing. I mean, I've been surprised how important a factor it has been in the attitude to Bosnia. So, unfortunately, you see, you have to go quite deep and quite abstract and quite general to realize that our vital interests are involved. And this idea that we are living in an open society, and if we weren't, we would be much less happy, just hasn't been established. I mean, as I say, people just don't think in those terms.
But you also have to address, I would add to, it's fine to say what's important, but you also have to say what would you do about it, because some things are important and are just
Incidentally, this is particularly true of the defense establishment. I mean, this is, it's hard-headed, we have to be hard-headed, we have to look out for our national interest. That is our dogma. And I think it's a false dogma. You see, I think that you do have to look out for this systemic interest, And if you don't, you end up in like you did in the Second World War. You see, it was.
I happen to agree with you on that, but let me stick up for the malign defense establishment. I don't agree with the attitude entirely, but I think everybody wearing a uniform gets a little exasperated at columnists who take out their own need to do something about this morally objectionable situation by sending someone else's kid to get killed. And they think very, very much about the question of getting people into a situation where lots of Americans will get killed, and before long people will forget why they were dying. And the emphasis that comes is not only on the reluctance to get killed, but the reluctance to get killed in a situation that has no end and no way out of it.
No, I realize that. I mean, it's very clear that there is a new defense doctrine which is emerging, right, based on the experience of Vietnam and the experience of Iraq, that incrementalism, no. If you have a clear objective, you can bring overwhelming power to bear, and you can have a clear victory with minor casualties. That's yes, right? Now, Bosnia doesn't qualify. It simply just doesn't qualify. There is no victory to be had in Bosnia. All you can do in Bosnia, you can interdict the success of this, let's say, ethnic cleansing policy. You can't actually, you don't want to. I mean, you have a limited objective. Bosnia is not a state that you want to necessarily preserve as such. But you don't want the ethnic principle to succeed. And you in fact, you want to punish it. Even if in the end it succeeds, because I don't think you can put Bosnia. I mean, Bosnia is all over. I mean, we are as far as a multi-ethnic society, but still, there ought to be some interdiction of the ethnic principle.
The other issue may be that a case like Bosnia really involves a multilateral will that goes beyond even a nation.
Yeah.
Let me bring this to a close by suggesting that you may have started us off in leading to this kind of predicament when you talked about, or dilemma, when you talked about society and government. Mm-hmm. And I, first of all, want to say I'm grateful to you for coming into a government agency and talking about the importance of society.
Well,
and
you are people too.
We're grateful. We're grateful for the
openness to
your openness in this conversation. Even though there have been no clues given here to investments, you have given us some sense of why you care enough about humanity in the future to engage it the way you have. And as I sat here and listened to you and thought about things you've done and themes of our conversations, thinking sometimes, as we have, rather grave thoughts about the present time and the future, I remembered something that was written when Isaac Bashevis Singer died last year. He was asked once, "Are we free?" And he said, "We must believe we're free. We have no other choice." So thank you for being here. It's very good to have you. Thank you all for being here.